I wanted to start just by asking Matthew to give a brief overview of his book that is hot off the presses, and kind of also maybe what brought you to writing it.
Yeah, the book is out there, and it's called Practice and All is Coming, and the subtitle is Abuse, Cultic Dynamics, and Healing in Yoga and Beyond. And if I were to summarize in a few points what I think it does, but reviewers might differ, I believe that it puts to bed the notion that that the mainstream yoga culture known as Ashtanga Yoga does not have a significant abuse history problem at its core. It certainly does. The 16 testimonies of the women who were able to provide them for the book, who described being assaulted by Batavi Joyce over about a 30-year period in broad daylight, put the question to rest. I also think it's significant that what the story that really was relegated to a kind of whisper network for many years is now, public, fact-checked, and that it's about not a fringe group, but rather a mainstreamed, highly profitable, spectacularly culturally influential yoga organization that is really visible in all sectors of the fitness economy. And we don't really have, I think, a comparable example of cultic dynamics playing out in such a diffuse and popularized sense to this point. So I think that's significant. And I also think that the story was able to be told because survivors found each other, and they sometimes found me, or they found each other, and then they found me, or I found them. But a network of empowerment began to develop that I really think relied on the mentorship that, from my perspective, I received in understanding how to begin to put together a victim-centered account, where the testimonies of the actual subjects are at the core of the book. And I think that mainstream journalism and certainly legal frameworks have a hard time really listening to survivors in an open, empathetic, receptive, and credulous way. It doesn't seem like our narrative structures are set up for that. So I had a lot of help from my editor at the Walrus magazine in Canada in beginning to think about what it meant to place the victim's, the survivor's voice at the center of an analysis. Because I think the truth is that if the survivor of cultic abuse or high demand abuse within a yoga group or in a Buddhist organization, which is the other area that I look at, if they're not in the center of the discussion of not only what happened, but what could have been prevented or what should be prevented in the future, then there really won't be any new data that's learned. And here I'll refer to my colleague Dr. Wildcroft again by saying that early on, sometime in this research process, she made a remark about how it's the survivor, the trauma survivor especially, who is the person who calls us to truth about the systems that we live in, the culture that we're a part of. They're like the canary in the coal mine. They can feel very closely and very specifically what the gears of oppression do. So I'm happy that I was able to learn a little bit about what it meant to listen to survivors. And think also, the last thing that I'd say about the book is that I hope that it begins to normalize and destigmatize the language of cult analysis. And that is due in large part, or if that's possible in my book, it's due in large part to the work of Dr. Stein, whose application of attachment theory to cultic dynamics is an extraordinary, in my opinion, forward step in the discourse, because it begins to bring the question of what a cult is out of this sort of othering and almost paranoid sensibility, and into a question of what kinds of relationships do we actually have, what kinds of relationships bind our groups together. And the genius of taking attachment theory and making it the centerpiece for looking at cultic control is that she's actually using, there's a lot of things I could say about it, but she's actually using a theory that every single psychotherapist in the world is likely referring to, if not using explicitly in their work every single day with every single client. And so this very personal, intimate way of understanding the way in which bonds are formed is then used to look at social dynamics in a very novel way. And I think we get out of the question of, are you in a cult, and more deeply into the question of what kind of relationships are you involved in. And that's, I think that de-escalates and normalizes and destigmatizes the problem of high demand control in an extraordinarily positive way. And so I'd like to thank you for that. I think that's it's extraordinary. If you haven't read Dr. Stein's book or books, especially Terror and Brainwashing and Love, it's a long title.
Terror, Love and Brainwashing.
Terror, Love and Brainwashing. I get the order reversed or mixed up, but if you haven't read that, it's fantastic. And so, and then I said it was the last thing, but the really last thing is that the book is hopefully useful in training and pedagogical contexts for yoga teachers, and maybe also instructors of Buddhist organizations. The last part of the book is a workbook that is filled with questions for self and community inquiry. So I hope that's helpful.
Your book, Matthew, is a really forensic unpicking of the dynamics of that his interviewees and participants reported, and it's really quite an amazing and I think very, very well and accurately analysed piece of work, talking about the relationships and the belief systems and the deifying of the guru in particular, which is always a warning sign in my view. And it's also really a fascinating and useful contribution. And I was particularly happy that Nadia kind of introduced us, because I've certainly over the last several years run into many people who have talked about being in yoga cults of a variety of kinds, and that this has not been much in the press or talked about until Bikram Yoga, and people may have heard of him from the hot yoga empire, until he kind of got done for his various crimes.
Right.
But I already knew from the grapevine that I'm involved with of many other groups that were doing the same kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And it feels very important to me that we talk about this because, as we know, yoga is sort of flavor of the month, right? I mean, everybody does yoga now, and it's in the schools, and it's yoga and mindfulness and various other of these wellness modalities are really the thing. And too many of them are engaging in these kind of dynamics. So I think I was, really thrilled that there was such a deep analysis now available to us to look at that.
I have, as you say, I have analyzed one particular circumstance where the founder of the Ashtanga yoga method, Pattabhi Jois is shown to have enacted criminal acts for about 30 years and been enabled. But yeah, you were also wondering about is this happening in other yoga organizations? And I can say yes, absolutely. And the question more actually is, or might be, what groups is it not happening in? I actually have a list that I use in a presentation, and I'll pull it out here. So yes, all of the groups that I'm going to name here are not. They're not all the same, and I'm not lumping them all together, but I would describe them as all having unaddressed abuse histories, and many of them feature cultic dynamics. So we have, I've studied Ashtanga Yoga. The Iyengar Yoga organization worldwide is going through its own set of crises right now. Bikram Yoga, as Dr. Stein mentioned, the Jivamukti brand, the Anusara brand, if anybody remembers that, Kundalini Yoga, KHYF in Chennai, Satyananda Yoga, which was the subject of an Australian Commission investigation into, I think, institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Siddha Yoga, Rajneesh, the Himalayan Institute, and then a number of Buddhist organizations that I look into or that I study and publish about, Rigpa, Shambhala, and then one of the high demand groups that I was involved with, that I was recruited into, Diamond Mountain or Asian Classics Institute. And what this means is, when I show this list to a room full of yoga people, they look sort of, tilt their head a little bit and say, okay, well, what is okay, or what has been what has been safe, and as I've said, it's not as if the organizations are all equally troubled, and there are various levels of coercion, and then at different time periods in history, and there are crises, and then they get buried or they resolve somewhat. But I would just go back to the definition of these are all organizations with unresolved and usually untransparent to the public abuse histories. And what that means is that almost everybody in the yoga world who has professionalized can track their teaching and their content, their teaching method and their content, back to an organization that has some unresolved shadow stuff going on. And that's important. Because we wind up with lines of teachers and students who aren't quite clear with each other about what the history has been and what harm organizations have done. So, yeah, I'd say it's a widespread issue, and it's a feature of an unregulated industry.
And I mean, a couple of things. One is that it seems like Kundalini Yoga is particularly susceptible, from what I've seen as a non-yoga person, and I don't know if that's because there's more intense kind of physiological arousal that happens with Kundalini Yoga that's sort of seen as part of the, that's where you're attaining whatever you're supposed to attain. And also I just want to say one other thing, that there's different, it's helpful to think of these groups as structures that are structured like the layers of an onion. So you may have people on the outside who simply go to a hot yoga class and they enjoy it, and that's the beginning and end of it. But as you get further into the center and closer to the leader, things tend to get more and more abusive. So there's different kind of dimensions that it's important to look at these things. And also you may have, so to speak, franchises of a big brand, that different franchises may operate differently, where some are more cultic than others. So again, it's not to say that the whole thing is, but it is to say that the teacher-student relationship, and particularly the kind of guru-student relationship, is one where there's an inbuilt authority that is subject to making it easier for these dynamics to take place, and they are. So.
It can be, for sure. And I appreciate the layers of the onion metaphor. One of the big problems that I came up against in researching and beginning to talk about this project was resistance from Ashtanga community members who would say, well, I don't feel as though I'm part of a cultic dynamic at all, and are you labeling Ashtanga yoga globally as a cult? And my answer, which was never quite communicated well enough, I think, was that no, Ashtanga yoga is a globally branded and diffuse organization that has particular centers of power, and the one that I focus on in my study is its originary center in Mysore, India. As Dr. Stein says, you might feel as though you might be on the outside periphery of an organization where you enjoy the benefits of the breath work and the postures and the meditation instruction that you get, and you don't really have any contact with the difficult power dynamics that begin to compound closer to the center. One metaphor that I used in the book is that of the forest fire map of California. So I don't know if you saw this or you see this periodically over here in newscasts, but when the forest fires take over California, they'll show a picture of the state in full, and you'll see that there are flashpoints of red in key areas where the major catastrophic fires are, but of course there's a lot of white in the area, which really should be green unless it's desert. But if we think of Ashtanga yoga as a geographical space of many variations, like the state of California, there's going to be a lot of green space in it. And there's going to be then spaces of perhaps yellow or orange in it. And then there are going to be flashpoints of red, where a very particular combination of charismatic control, the situational vulnerability of participants, and the drive towards community cohesion is really, really high. And where that happens, we end up having people being burned. But the thing that I like about the metaphor is that the empty or non-burning space of California is actually going to be responsible for reseeding what has been destroyed by fire. And I think that's a very, hopeful, perhaps naive, but hopeful way of looking at things. That it's actually the diversity of a global community like Ashtanga Yoga, which is part of its potential resilience in the face of cultic dynamics that begin to concentrate in particular areas.
I wonder if we can talk a bit about what those dynamics are.
Right.
The question I had, because I tend to study the cults that are a little bit less dispersed, a little bit more concentrated, where there's a great deal of isolation. I talk about this triple isolation of people who are in a kind of classic cult, where they're isolated from the outside world, they're isolated internally from each other because they can't share their doubts about what's going on. And they're also then isolated from their own inner thinking and their inner critical voice about what's going on, because that's very hard to maintain that if you're not in conversation with your peers. Right. So I wasn't clear from your book how much of that was going on. It seemed like some of that isolation was going on, but maybe you could speak about that and other elements of control that were happening.
Right. I think that what's unique about the Ashtanga Yoga situation, maybe it's not unique. It's unique to use cultic discourse to study it because we don't really have a hard boundary around the organization. It's not like it's not like there's a clear moment in which you step over the threshold and you're there and you're bubbled within and you are fully isolated and you take a number of pledges to disown your family or what have you. Most people maintain outside connections, but as they get closer and closer to the center, or they increase the intensity of their practice, other relationships that would provide reality checking begin to fall by the wayside. They might begin to make life decisions professionally that restrict their ability to network with other ideas about life or other ways of being in the world. But at the center, the core mechanisms of deception, dependency, and dread of leaving are going to be very highly charged for those who get closest, for those who want to professionalize. And this is a key point, is that on the outside periphery, you will not have contact with those who have the true message of Ashtanga Yoga unless you are learning from people who have gone all the way to the center and have been, personally certified and blessed by Pattabhi Jois when he was alive, and now his grandson and heir, Sharath Jois. So, there's that first layer of isolation between the person and the outside world is very gray. It's fuzzy. Isolation within the group, I think, is much more clear, because amongst the interview subjects that I spoke to, one very common report was that there were certain subjects that we just wouldn't broach. The content of our conversation was set. It was very difficult to ask questions. And then that inner sense of isolation from your own morality or your own ethics, that was very strong in many interviews as well, that somehow the person began to lose touch with any kind of internal sense of resistance that they would have to the ideology, or the sense that they have to practice harder, or the sense that they should be looking at the physical pain that they were in as some sort of spiritual breakthrough or something like that. So but it's hard. There's no outside boundary, and I think that's why it's really beneficial to start using cult dynamic language and apply it to more diffuse organizations, because it's because of that diffuse boundary that people can be drawn in towards the center almost imperceptibly.
And so in my work, I'm also trying to use the concept of dangerous relationships, which I think is what you're responding to. That though these can happen in these very contained organizations, there are many other versions. And I've kind of asked Matthew not to be too graphic in his descriptions of the abuse, but I think maybe we've gone overboard and not talked about that there was, quite intense sexual abuse of practitioners, and also physical injury.
Right. I could just say briefly that there's 16 testimonies in the book, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. One of the interview subjects, named Jubilee Cook, who wrote her own fantastic essay called "Why Didn't Anybody Warn Me?" She does the math based upon her tenure at Joyce's Yogashala in Mysore over about an 8-month period, I believe. And she describes how many times she herself was assaulted, and then how many times she watched her colleagues be assaulted. And then she totals up the years and goes through the world tours and comes up with what she says is the conservative estimate of there having been potentially 30,000 individual acts of sexual assault. So I print that in the book because it's entirely plausible. The math works out, and the patterning that I see from the 16 testimonies extrapolated to that scale would certainly make sense. That means that we have a sexual predator operating in plain sight at the heart of a mainstream yoga community that is influencing the global yoga industry in major ways. And that is, you asked me, how did you get into writing the book? I actually didn't want to write the book because as soon as I thought of the implications of what that meant, I was very much disturbed that somehow this secret had been kept by so many people in so many ways, and its after effects were impacting so many around the world. So like terrible story of serial abuse, and in such a and so many instances that we really can't talk about it in any other way but in systemic terms. Nobody abuses alone, and nobody heals alone either.
And what you have is this culture where it's just continually excused, like, well, he didn't mean to do it, or that didn't really happen, so people not believing their own eyes, which, there's some classic social psychology experiments that, notably the Ash Lines experiment, where we know that if you have a unanimous majority of 3 people saying, no, that didn't happen, the one person will find it very difficult to stand up to what they're actually seeing. And so you really see that dynamic happening, that, or no, they're just giving adjustments, or all this kind of, or, this is the master, so it must be right. All the things that we see in cults as,
right.
variety of control mechanism.
Right. The opening narrative from an anonymous subject describes being assaulted on her first day there, and says that immediately after the class, a senior student approached her and preemptively gaslighted her by saying, "You know that what just happened to you was not sexual assault, right?" And this set the tone for the next several months, where a series of cryptic justifications, to use the words of Karen Rain, were deployed over and over and over again to preempt any kind of resistance. Cast sexual assault as a kind of healing gesture or touch or transfer of esoteric energy. Quite incredible, actually, and tragic. Or it's a moment of extraordinary stress response. I mean, because you're talking about all kinds of physiological pressures that are building up. You're sleep deprived. Your diet was probably was it calorie reduced?
Frozen sandwiches.
Right. That doesn't. Yeah. Right. And was there physical labor? You were doing a lot on the print shop. Is that right?
Well, we were exhausted. I mean,
right.
People went to a regular day job for 8 hours a day, and then went directly to a cult job for
right.
another 8 hours unpaid labor.
Right.
It was just it was exhausting,
right.
and I don't know if in the practice, when people are over practicing in yoga, if there's that same thing where you're.
Oh, I think that exhaustion and over practice is a great untold story for sure. Yeah, and also a buildup of chronic pain and injuries that don't quite heal, for sure. The moment of euphoric release. It was a stunning thing for me to come across in your book, because that particular moment is so often described as an epiphany within yogic and Buddhist circles, but never with any kind of sort of sociological context. Well, but how did it actually, what was going on around the person that allowed that to happen? Usually it's narrated as some sort of like individual breakthrough. And in fact, I looked at a lot of Ashtanga literature that spoke about these moments of transcendent, flooding of the body with warm sensations of liberation, as though the practice or some sort of internal realization had created them. But in the narratives themselves, they're also talking about how Pattabhi Jois is manhandling their bodies and sometimes injuring them at the same time. And so your capacity to release internal opiates during dangerous moments, your capacity to really self-medicate through all kinds of cortisol and adrenal strategies is extraordinary. And I think there's a great unstudied phenomenon of people having peak experiences in yoga and Buddhist meditation circles that are really misinterpretations of stress responses.
I just want to jump in because, what that is in my view is dissociation. So when you kind of get to that point, it's just you literally can't think about what's happening, you can't think about your feelings, so you dissociate. And I always want to say there are really great reasons to dissociate. Dissociation in and of itself is not a bad thing. If you're looking at a beautiful picture or a sunset or listening to some wonderful music, dissociate away, that's wonderful. But it's when someone is purposefully leading you into that state and then using that as a means of control that it's problematic. And one of the things that I think we try to educate people around is how to try to ascertain the, as you were saying, the kind of context in which that's happening and what are the power relationships in which that is happening, so that you know when is it in your control and when is it an exploiter using that to control you.
So much of the developmental narrative of the yoga practice is really centered upon these moments of internal epiphany. I felt flooded with love. I felt one with everything. I felt a sense of absolute peace and rest. And I think it would be so wonderful if we could get every practitioner to ask the question, did this really come through my own agency? Did this come through a consensual process by which I was given a couple of tools that I then applied to my own internal working and was able to see something different about myself? Because the last thing that I would want to do with a book like this is to shy people away from practicing yoga or meditation. It's more like, can you begin to see that when you practice yoga and meditation, you're going to be doing so within a social context, and you're going to be doing so within a series of power dynamics, and you're going to be doing so in a place of potential vulnerability. So